Hello, welcome to part two of this episode of the J plus R movie podcast. Similarly to our last episode where we covered Invisible Man 33 in 2020, we're going to be covering two different horror films, one original, another one being a remake. So this week, Black Christmas 1974 and Black Christmas 2019. To give a brief plot summary, both films do have plot outline of it's a bunch of sorority girls on Christmas, and there is a killer basically stalking them and killing them one by one. But it's different between both films. Let's start talking about the original film.
Okay, so one thing that I really want to say off the bat, I like the concept of the crank call rather than actually, properly seeing the killer. I mean, you get glimpses, but you don't get like a proper full-fledged reveal of, oh yeah, this is the killer. I really like that because it kept the tension up throughout the film. Like, I really leading you to believe it was Peter, but there was just a couple of things that were really off about it being Peter as well. Crank calls got increasingly worse, and people got scared. And I don't know, it felt like something that would legit happen, legit and grounded, while also being terrifying and unexplained. Again, I love that in a horror film. Whenever I see that in a horror film, I am happy.
Black Christmas 1974, I think it works very, very well. Not really as a slasher film, but kind of almost as like a social horror film. Because of that element that you're talking about, balls themselves, like that aspect of it, it's mundane, it's believable. The killer who is doing this, you don't really know why he's doing it, so therefore all you get is just that he wants to just terrorize these women. The stuff he's talking about, you don't really understand it, but that's because it just sounds like the ramblings of a crazy person, but you do know that it has an underlying threat to it, or even an overlying threat to it when he just outright says, I want to kill you, I think.
I quite liked the opening phone call a lot because it felt like the kind of creepy shit you hear about. Like, he goes on a very, very sexually explicit rant to Margot Kidder's Barb. And then it ends it just pretty much out of nowhere with "I'm gonna kill you," and it was at the point where you could dismiss it as a crank call while completely setting up, the murders, which obviously then happened. And sure, one thing I'm actually going to say about the murders is a couple of them were quite creative, to be honest. Hanging someone up the laundry chute with a hook was quite good. You say it doesn't function so well as a slasher film, and I agree, it's not like a traditional gore-fest slasher film. I think it still hits most of the tropes quite all right. You've got the unknown killer who may or may not have some sort of weird, creepy, supernatural ability to just escape getting caught or hurt. You've got some fairly creative kills. I mean, they don't really show too many of them. Barb's murder with a figurine was quite interesting, even though it was admittedly just a bunch of stabbing. But the fact that it was a figurine was quite interesting.
The first kill as well, the plastic bag.
It was just a really good image, and what I do love as well is we linger on the bodies quite a lot, especially at the end. You get first victim who's been missing the whole time, and everyone kind of knows is dead, but doesn't really know is dead. I mean, she is dead, but they don't know that for absolute sure. You just kind of get her face as the camera pulls out from the attic window, where you can hear the killer's voice over it. I just think that's one of the most effective shots ever because it sets up the killer's still alive. You didn't get him.
I haven't even found that body as well.
People disappear. Things don't get wrapped up neatly. People like that are still out there and probably escape justice. Have fun with that, kids. I quite liked that. It was just really effective horror. It was scary. It was unsettling.
Obviously, you can make comparisons between this and like Halloween. It does have that similar. The killer is still out there. And the only difference is the fate of the final girl, Jess, is kind of left up in the open compared to Halloween, where you kind of knew that Laurie Strode was okay. But yeah, it does have that like quality about it. And also, I want to talk about the direction as well. It felt very ahead of its time, especially in regards to those like POV shots of the killer. Because I think that's
fantastic.
Because that was where like the direction I think shined the most, especially in the opening where you're first like seeing the killer walking up to the house and he starts climbing up the thing and then he like gets into the house, and it cuts that perspective a lot, and it makes him, on the one hand, it gives you more of a personal like view into his world. It also kind of distances you from him because you don't know what he looks like. He could just be anybody. I mean, the only time you get a bit of a look at him is just that famous shot where like he's holding the figurine and you see his eye. There's that bit, but other than that, you never actually see his face. It really makes him more anonymous as well, compared to Michael Myers. Sure, Michael Myers could have been anybody, but you still have enough to like specify Michael Myers. Whereas with this person, it's like Billy Like you don't even know if his name is Billy. He just says the name Billy, and you assume that is an entity, but he could be anybody.
Yeah, he could be. And I think the crucial thing is we don't really see him like we do Michael Myers. Michael Myers, as much as they try and make him supernatural, becomes something that is tangible at least. He's there, he's visible. Enough descriptions you could either pick him out or you could find out more about him. It sets you up exactly what he is. Disturbed kid who killed his sister and then kind of recreates that kill. You know what he is. Billy, you know he crank calls and you know he kills people, but that's about it. You don't get any reason to why. You don't get a psychology. You just get the fear of some killer breaking into a sorority house and just systematically murdering them. And then you get the tension build up amongst the sorority sisters as they're kind of struggling to deal with that. And it's all set around Christmas, which is great because it provides contrast, because it's meant to be the very, very happy time and a great period and that for people to be in. So it creates a really, really beautiful aesthetic. I think my favourite sequence where they make best use of Christmas is when the carolers come out and the wreath is around, and then Margot Kidder's Barb is just getting murdered to Christmas choir music. And I just think that's great because it's creepy as hell because it's just wrong. But I think also what it does is it sets up some of the social expectations against the women as well because the film does explore, I'd say, quite feminist issues, around abortion and around, the way women should be living their lives. Like, there's a big thing with Barb and her. With Barb, she's on the phone getting kind of criticised for her drinking a lot by everyone around her. And don't get me wrong, she's clearly an alcoholic, but at the same time, it's kind of in a way that if a man acted like that, they'd probably get away with it. And that's quite clear in the film. Or the way that Peter's massively pressuring Jess to not have the abortion that she wants. You get that kind of pressurizing society, which comes around with Christmas, family values, all of that. And I think it's what makes this film work really well.
That is an interesting juxtaposition, obviously, because, like Christmas, you can relate that to, like Christianity, family values and tradition and stuff. And then you're seeing these characters who are kind of going against that. Good as a slasher film, don't get me wrong. It is quite scary and it is quite effective. But I do think it is improved when you think about it more as, again, a commentary on a lot of different issues. Like, so the ones you bring up are like the main examples of it, and there are even other examples, like the older mother figure of the group being like an alcoholic and kind of not really liking the father of one of the girls who comes in and is a bit more like stuffy. It even extends to the portrayals of some of like the male characters as well, where you have that police officer who doesn't know what the term fellatio means, even shown in like the father being all like there is probably like having sex or like having a boyfriend or something, or something like he's having like fairly
being missing almost.
Yeah, or saying like, oh man, this isn't a good environment, when there's nothing really wrong with the environment until Billy arrives. It's like you have those aspects, and then you have again the two ones. The most important one being the storyline with Bess being pregnant and then wanting an abortion, and Peter, her boyfriend, but constantly just saying no. And that one bit as well, where he basically just says, oh, "I'm quitting the conservatory and we're getting married." It's like he just says, he doesn't even propose. He just says, "We're getting married."
Like, no, we're getting married, and she's like, "Nope, no, we're not."
Like you could say it's kind of averting the stereotype of like the final girl being like a virgin, but also what it's kind of doing is it's kind of saying like, even though Jess is might be an innocent nice girl, she still isn't willing to like give in to the demands of her boyfriend, and she's still willing to at every turn completely go against what her boyfriend wants. And ironically enough, the film kind of punishes Peter, the boyfriend, because if he just stayed away, then he wouldn't have died at the end.
No, he wouldn't have, because the whole reason that he was down is because he decided to break back into that basement. I'm assuming to talk to Jess. I'm assuming that was his point, but look dodgy as hell for one. I mean, Jesus, man, knock on the front door like a normal person. My God. But more importantly, it kind of just sets up that sense of almost entitlement that there was back in the 70s for it. Yeah, how oppressive that is. And I think one thing that I did really love about the film is that it had layered, complex, realistic female characters that were allowed to be vulnerable and tough, that were allowed to kind of just be people. That's kind of what the goal is, today, following, the Me Too movement and all of that. That's what people were kind of pushing for, but then it's kind of being done in a very cheap way at the moment. I think in quite a few films, being done in a
Yeah,
way
well,
that's
okay, it can be done well or it can be done
it,
badly, and
yeah,
this
yeah.
is
But I think there's kind of a way that it's being done in some modern films. It's a bit, I don't know, it doesn't feel organic or real. If you get what I mean, if you
yeah, I got yeah,
well,
no, I understand it, but but yeah, because
well,
in this one,
this film near enough 50 years ago now.
yeah, it has aged well in that respect. You can even view Billy the Killer as the stand-in for like misogynistic, entitled men who are even willing to kill women who go against the norm in a sense,
Yeah,
or who do stuff, or even or is even just willing to kill any woman, just any woman that like they want to. Although there's no real like pushback against that, by portraying it on screen, it kind of says like this is bad. These women and what they represent is good. Even like the Barb character, even this like one bit that I noticed where she was like drawing on a Playboy magazine or something. And
mm,
it's like she seemed like she was into men, but she was drawing on a Playboy magazine, and even that mere hint that she could have been like bi and that she could have liked women. Obviously, if you were to do that in today, they probably would have just come out and said it. But
yeah.
even back then, even just that mere hint.
It didn't focus on a detail that was ultimately irrelevant to the story because Barb's love life really isn't relevant to the story at all. But it just kind of gives a little hint here and there, just little bits of characterization. It does that throughout the film. Like it has little moments and little things that it will do. Like depending on how the characters are just moving and how they are. And they don't state things necessarily about their character. They just are what they are. And I love that. I miss that I miss that in writing. That said, I obviously don't mind when characters kind of trying to state their goals if they're talking to someone else and trying to persuade them and things like that. That's not what I'm arguing against. But quite often, character traits will get spelled out a lot. And this one kind of just went, these other traits.
The older housekeeper woman being like an alcoholic is just shown to us because she's constantly handling alcohol, or like in instances where the characters do kind of say stuff that adds to their traits. It's not like they're just spelling it out. It's like they are just saying stuff that kind of adds to that. When Barb goes on her last scene, which kind of alternates between funny and sad, like the bit with Barb where she just suddenly goes on that thing about turtles having sex,
I was laughing about it, just weird. Yeah,
which kind of expresses stuff about her character, that she kind of likes being that she kind of is a bit of an embarrassing person to be around, but it also kind of makes sense as like a funny anecdote that she's trying to share to distract from what she says afterwards, where she's like, you're all just blaming me for this, aren't you? Which kind of then adds to like the feeling of insecurity and the feeling of, oh, I'm just kind of putting on an air, and in reality I'm broken up about what's going on with Claire, and I'm worried that you all think I'm responsible.
the character work in that scene is just very very layered, and I like it because it at once shows why you would want Barb around because she is kind of funny and pretty fun. Shows that she absolutely goes too far because it would
Mhm.
be a bit embarrassing. Kind of gets that she's vulnerable. She's vulnerable, but she likes to cover that up a lot. Got real human traits and compassion and things like that, but she consistently throughout the film, like the way she deals with the crank calls and the way she deals with things moving forward, she puts on a lot of bravado and she's like, we're dealing with this very, very seriously and very, very securely. We don't need to get upset about this. This is fine. Well, she actually is upset about it. And she
Mhm.
almost seems like she's just trying to steer the ship so things stay okay. I quite like a little detail of her character because she's fairly supportive of the other people in the house as much as she is playing to the stereotype of the bitter drunk a little bit, but
Mhm.
not massively. There's loads of layers underneath that just make her compelling. Like I really connected with the character to be honest. So when she died, I felt that.
Actually, I wanted her to live, but so I was sad when she didn't. It can be kind of harder with like a character like that, but they did manage to make you, although you could understand why people wouldn't like her, you still liked her. First time in a while in a slasher film where I actively did not want somebody to die, where I actively was. I mean, I was like that with Jess at the end. I didn't want her to die. But I was very actively like, come on, I don't want her to die. She's had a hard time,
I mean,
Yeah,
there was just a bit of, oh, not Bob. Come
mhm,
on, not Bob.
yeah.
I've not felt that in a slasher film for a while. Even Halloween, I didn't care that the other woman died.
Because they were kind of just a bit like
She
Laurie's
was a
friends were just a
terrible
bit.
babysitter.
Yeah,
Gosh, like that was near child endangerment. I'm pretty sure. Ugh,
I think the last time I felt that way was actually the latest Halloween.
I will give that. I also felt a bit. I didn't think they all deserved to die. I think especially when they were escaping and
Yeah,
you thought they were going to get away, and then Michael Myers just shows up and kills the
yeah.
guy. You're just like, oh. I think one more thing I do want to say before we move on to the 2019 one is about the kind of the non-diegetic sound in the film, because it's beautiful, like with diegetic sound contrasting with the kind of events on screen, and I liked that. And obviously, I did also like the stairs creaking, just because it helped add the old horror aspect. But then I noticed as I was listening to kind of the score go, which was effective, but fairly wasn't exactly unique, but it was effective.
I kind of more liked, all the movements of the killer, how you could like hear his footsteps, the sort of creaking of the floor, and I quite liked how loud the killer was because whenever he
But
was
that
like,
was breathing. Oh.
whenever he was yelling, increased the volume enough to where it was like physically, it was uncomfortable to listen to.
Yeah,
And
I mean, at one point holding the phone away from themselves, and you could still hear them at full volume. You're just like, Jesus, how loud are you being? Christ.
again, I think it's effective as a horror film. Even though the kills aren't seen on screen, there's enough good build up to them. And by just showing the aftermath, it's just a lot more like disturbing and visceral just to kind of like see the build up to it and then see the aftermath, but not see the actual kill itself. It doesn't rely on jump scares too much. There are a couple of jump scares. The first one, that when the Claire girl, when she gets like, I was expecting that, but it still actually made me jump when Billy the Killer comes through the plastic thing. The same goes for other bits as well, especially like the climax as well. The climax was really intense. But again, I think it's more interesting if you view it again from the social lens. I would argue it's maybe the most liberal horror film I've ever seen. You know,
Yeah, I guess so. I
I, I
mean,
mean, I mean, I don't typically put films or horror films into that category, but if you're like left wing at all, then I think you'll probably enjoy it. It's in favor of those like ideologies and stuff, and it doesn't
well, it
necessarily
does.
betray them. It more just kind of says like, well, here are the consequences of being this kind of person in this society.
I would argue that horror films are actually fairly liberal. They just have to be wrapped up in a conservative bow at the end to kind of keep the pundits happy and get the films actually made. But it's the same way that the vampire films often been associated with lesbianism, and there's always been a sense of attraction to it, even though obviously they have to kind of shut it down, like ever since the 50s and things like that. But I
Yeah, a
think
lot
this
of gay horror films as well.
yeah, and a lot of modern days horror films do the same thing. Yeah, I'm not. I'm just saying. I think historically, it's always been a medium where they play with those ideas and actually do have kind of a liberal message that they kind of have to explicitly shut down, but implicitly it's still there. But this film does it explicitly, but without beating you over the head with it, and it just works so much better because you care so much about the characters, and they kind of present those beliefs just naturally as characters. You start to care about those beliefs because you care about the characters and you care about that. So then, as you move through, you're carried along with the film's message, and you are kind of get upset at the way that the society is kind of oppressing these women, and you like the fact that Jess may or may not have escaped it. You really hope that she does at the end, even though the dread is setting in, and it's just
And it adds this sort of like interesting like dimension to what's going on. It's not simply that like women are being killed. It's these specific kinds of women are being killed. I'll admit that like to modern sensibilities, if you're expecting something more in the vein of Halloween or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, then it might not.
it is tame on the gore. That is something I noticed.
And those two films that I just mentioned weren't necessarily that violent, but I just mean in terms of intensity, because I do think that those two films are a bit more intense. Whereas Black Christmas, although it's intense, it operates on a bit more of a slow burn. Like it's more slow
Yeah,
paced. It kind of operates in real time, and it kind of just it's like and those other two films I just mentioned kind of did that as well. But this one a bit more so. It is fairly slow paced, but it does make up for that by getting intense when it needs to get intense. And last point as well, acting really great. Bringing up Margot Kidder, she was really damn good in this
oh,
film.
I loved her in this film.
She managed to make that character not obnoxious, which I think another actor could have done, but she didn't. She didn't come off as not obnoxious. She definitely helped to kind of add to the kind of because there is actually comic relief in the film as well. There is actually humor.
Yeah, and I think that kind of helps it as well because again, it creates that contrast. I think creating just contrast in tone is really, really important. You then get that sense of the horror feels more horrific. It doesn't become normalized in any way.
Olivia Hussey did a really great job as Jess, especially like at the end in that final bit. That was like she really did a really excellent job there. I don't know who the hell was voicing Billy the Killer.
Whoever was doing a great job.
yeah, even he did an amazing job. All right, well, let's start talking about the 2019 version.
Can't believe you did this to me. I still can't believe you did this to me.
Yeah, well, I think no, I think it's necessary as a comparison to make.
No, it definitely is. I'm just having fun here.
Yeah. The first thing to say right off the back is I don't think it should have been called Black Christmas because it's got some homages to the original film, but largely it kind of just does its own thing. I will admit that in the age of like, the Disney remakes and other remakes as well, even some horror remakes like the Psycho remake, normally that would be kind of admirable to have a remake go in its own direction and kind of do its own thing. But unfortunately, like in the process, they kind of get very, very far away from what the original Black Christmas was about. And what they basically do with this film is that they kind of take the themes in the original and put them more at the forefront, which in theory is a very noble goal. Like, it's a very, very good idea. Unfortunately, it just doesn't make for a particularly good movie.
No, it doesn't. The way that they kind of do it doesn't work. It almost makes the message feel a bit hollow to me.
Like by putting it so much at the forefront, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm obviously not against the message, but it's the way it was done, especially, really hacks me off. Because it does that thing I hate when it happens in a horror film, right at the end. And I'm talking about the climax because the climax is like night and day to me between the two films. Like, why the hell did it end in a major fight? I mean, come on. There wasn't any threat to me when I was watching it. I was like, cool, right. Okay, they're in danger, are they? From dweeb frat boy? Did some horrific things, and I mean, he did straight up rape the protagonist, so and that's really horrific and awful. And I was happy he got his comeuppance, but the whole sequence was directed by someone who has clearly never really done an action scene before. I mean, Christ, what the hell was that? But more importantly, it kind of undercut any sense of tension, any sense of fear or horror from this thing, which was already done because it was like some supernatural cult rubbish, which I always hate because it's hardly ever done right. The only time I've seen it done well is The Devil Rides Out, 1968, and I will hold that.
Like what, like a cult reveal?
A cult reveal. I don't know. There's a real modern obsession with, it's a cult, except the cult's never interesting and anymore, and it's kind of just like, you're some weird murder cult. Why are you part of some weird murder cult? Is it a cultural thing? No. Did you just do it because? Is that all the reasoning you're already giving me? Yeah, great. Awesome. So scary. Okay, my rant about modern cults over. Yeah. Adding the supernatural element, it seemed to take a bit of responsibility off of the frat boys, which, don't get me wrong, they were completely responsible. Screw those guys. If you add that it was a supernatural entity kind of influencing them a bit, it kind of takes the teeth out of the horror that is, God, a person is doing this, an actual human person with no outside influence, it's just them, which is why Billy was so scary.
That's where both the films divulged the most, because in the original film, one person, normal guy, killer. In this one, not only do they have a different cast of characters in this one, not only is it like obviously updated to be more like modern, but also it's multiple killers for a supernatural cult that are basically possessed by this black goo that kind of is basically a metaphor for toxic masculinity. That it brings out your true alpha, essentially. It brings out your alpha male. Like, from a horror perspective, yeah, different, completely different, absolutely different, and nowhere near as scary and kind of silly. But also, thematically, you have the original Billy was a metaphor, arguably, for toxic masculinity. This one, it's basically like, imagine if toxic masculinity was literally something that you could then use to possess people. Take it even further by basically saying that it can like psychically possess people, because what they do later on in the film is that a couple of the men who are characterized as not being that bad, it kind of shows that it can psychically affect them.
Yeah, Landon, he's got a very on and nose line where it's like, it was controlling me. It wasn't me. I'm not like that. Even the characters in the film went, fuck off. I think the metaphor is meant to be, toxic masculinity has a kind of a hive effect. And if you're kind of, around it too much, it will start to impact you as a man.
Yeah, but the way they portrayed it in the film, at first it just seemed like, oh, okay, if it gets on you, it will bring it out. But then, by adding in the whole psychic stuff, it just raises a lot of questions. Like, how does it affect people? Like, do you have to be close to the bust? Is there a kind of radius to like who it can affect? Is who it affects chosen? Because the boyfriend gets affected by it, and he was like nowhere near the fraternity, the AKO fraternity, where this like bust that basically the goo comes from and it's transmitting this stuff comes in. And then they show at the end Landon is in the building and then it affects him. So like, is it supposed to be that when you go in the building it starts affecting you or whatever? It's not really explained very well, and that just leads me on to I think a problem with the film overall. The big problem I have with this movie is that there's a lot of stuff that just isn't fleshed out about it. There's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff that on the surface could read as a really interesting like, metaphor or character journey or even a plot point. It's like you have a lot of, but the film never really gives itself time to breathe. It never really gives itself time to properly focus on any of them. It kind of more just kind of says like, here's a lot of stuff and here's a very simple paper thin story to kind of carry them. And it's unfortunate because there are moments in this film that do work. There are things that I did like about this film. It's not necessarily what I'd call a disaster, but it is kind of a failure because it doesn't really succeed at what it's doing. I'll bring up some stuff that I did like. Sometimes the direction was good. There were some moments that were good. Whenever the camera just stayed still, and we just got like a bit of a long shot that kind of moved around, like those shots were good. Some of the horror moments were directed fine. It had a nice look to it, I guess.
It was quite clean, I would say the look was. It felt a bit polished. I'm always wary of polished looks for horror films, if I'm being honest.
In comparison to like Black Christmas, a much grittier look to it, a much less polished look. The direction to me felt a bit all over the place because sometimes it's just shot normally, sometimes it's shot fine. And then, but I lost count of how many zooms they did. It's like there was this motif that they did all throughout the film where it was constantly like zooming in and out. And so, like sometimes they do crash zoom. Sometimes it'd be subtle. Sometimes it'd be more noteworthy. Like they even employed like shaky cam. The direction did get worse as it went on. Especially you brought up that final battle scene. It's actually showing them fighting. It was like 1 second. It was like shot of this, shot of that, shot.
We didn't even see whole bodies really. We saw like bits of people. It was like that's not a compelling image. Cool. If you're going to turn your horror movie into an action film at the end, at least do it properly.
It was like 2 minutes as well. It didn't last very long. And if they'd extended it, then maybe that could have been a bit more exciting. But it's over with very, very quick. It's not really particularly scary either. There are some jump scares in the film, and I mean, I will admit that false one, it's definitely the worst jump scare in the film, but it also actually did get me. The bit where it's that classic cliched thing where instead of it being person goes up to another person and says hi, they instead tap them on the shoulder.
Yeah, it's a Halloween trick, and to be fair, I always love that. But the one thing that I miss about that jump scare is when it was done the first time, it was completely silent. That's why it was scary. Now it's done with a little bit of a music cue, like it's gonna be a jump scare. It's just like brilliant.
Yeah, and I knew it was going to happen, but it still got me. It's almost like the equivalent of some clapping next to your ear. You just go, fuck, fuck you. You tell them to fuck off because they scared you and stuff.
Well, I think it's the perfect example of a commentary from a comedian who turned around and said using that kind of jump scare in a horror film is like a comedian jumping into the audience, tickling an audience member, and then going, "Ha, you laughed, I'm funny."
Oh wow, that's good. That's a good. Whoever made that comparison is quite.
Yeah, I wanted to give the guy props. I can't remember what the comedian's name is. It's really upsetting me now because I usually remember that kind of thing. But I think a lot of the jump scares in this film were the prime example of that.
I can't remember too many ones that were necessarily false. There are other ones that aren't quite false, but they are like,
overblown.
Person turns around, there's somebody standing there. Doors closing, and then someone's there. Or turn the light on, killer's there. It's like it's just not particularly creative when it comes to the scares. So there's this like kind of awkward compromise that they do where on the one hand it is technically more violent than the original film, but it's also less because although you didn't see the kills in the original film, they still felt a lot more visceral than these kills, which kind of to me weren't particularly effective.
These kills kind of just happened, and you like saw them and they were violent, but you were desensitized to them. While the original kills, they felt visceral, they felt violent. The kills in this felt almost like busy work, is the way I'm going to put it.
Okay, well, this person gets killed. They get stabbed with an icicle, or they get tackled like Christmas lights, or there was a good maneuver that they kind of focused on a couple of times where one of the women got their keys and like used that as a weapon, and then one of the killers gets like stabbed in the neck. Like that was kind of creative, or even the one killer that has like a bow and arrow as well. All right, well, I guess I haven't seen a slasher killer operate like that. That was kind of creative, I guess.
It's kind of neat to see one of the sorority sisters then kind of use the bow at the end. That was kind of cool.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
give the film a little bit of credit where it's due.
But let's get into the characters because, oh my god.
Yeah.
It kind of has that problem that I feel sometimes slasher movies do have, where it doesn't necessarily make a lot of the characters unlikable, but it doesn't really give us enough time to get to know them as people. It does give us some scenes where some of the sisters like have banter with each other, and that's fine. You've got like the four main ones: Riley, Chris, Jesse, and Marty. Jesse and Marty don't really get anything. You know, they kind of just get like one of them has a boyfriend, the other one seems kind of ditzy, and that's kind of it. Like, so we don't really care when they die. There's not a moment like in the original film where when a character dies, you were like, oh man. You don't really have that moment. You just sort of go like, okay, well that's bad. I didn't really get to know you or anything. Has that as a flaw, I feel, or at least in regards to like certain major characters.
You could tell they were meant to have a relationship. They didn't feel like they had one.
Yeah, or at least no, it wasn't like fleshed out like it should have been. You
No,
know.
it wasn't like it felt shallow. It felt almost two dimensional in a way. They weren't quite. They didn't have the same sense of layers that the others did. It was Riley is traumatized and has to get through it a bit. Or they've got banter so they're friends.
Because they put emphasis on the whole like sister aspect, how it's like a sisterhood. But if we had gotten more of a sense of their friendship, and you could say that that the dialogue that they exchange might have been enough, but I do feel like the film would have been, again, it would have benefited.
To be fair, I never think that dialogue's enough though. Like they need to properly do things for each other. You sort of do it at the end, but there's nothing like at the start in case. Like if you're with a friend, there's a way that you interact with a friend that isn't just in a dialogue. There's some non-verbal stuff, and don't get wrong. For example, in Black Christmas, they were just super chill around each other like all the time.
You saw concern that they kind of had for Claire, which suggests a deep connection of him.
I mean, they were a bit concerned about Lindsay, but they didn't seem like massively. And again, Helena as well. Again, obviously, they have the big moment where Riley stops her getting raped, and that's good. That shows that Riley and Helena are friends. But then later, when she disappears, it's a bit meh.
Like Riley's bringing it up, and the friends don't. It sort of seem to be like brushing it off.
I guess maybe they're not close with the other friends. Maybe it's just Riley and Helena.
It's unfortunate because they kind of ruin this at the end, but like they do sort of establish a bit of a close friendship between Riley and Helena. They did have a bit of a nice exchange at the beginning where she gives her like that hairpin. That was a nice exchange. She's all like, "Oh, it's my job to take care of you" and stuff. Like that was a fine exchange. And that later on, it's like, okay, all right, well there is some stuff there, but again, unfortunately, they kind of ruin it. They do this really like moronic twist where they basically just have Helena be part of the group, essentially part of this cult. She just basically sold them out, and it's like,
yeah. And I mean, don't go, that kind of makes sense with the it's my job to take care of you. And again, it kind of takes up the whole traditional social expectations of what what a woman's role in society is, because obviously for a very long time it was that, and that's kind of what the movie is against. So that's the kind of reactionary response. But when you kind of watch that, because it's just like, okay, great. I mean, I sort of feel a sense of betrayal, but you didn't really care. She disappeared, so I don't really care.
I mean, Riley kind of cared.
She mentioned it, but she didn't really do that much about it. Like
what they do as well is that they basically, there's one element from the original that they do recreate is the whole like phone aspect, but instead of phone calls, it's just texts, and they're kind of
so much worse.
I agree.
Cinematically, that's a lot worse. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's probably just as terrifying in real life. And it's probably more accurate to modern times. I get all of that, but the thing that that gives us the phone call so much power, especially in cinema, is that you've got a voice, you've got a character on the other side. A text message is the same way as getting an email in film. Boring. But even Bourne, which has information in emails and things like that, has a better reaction from the main characters to it. Like you get suddenly this almost slightly unstable shot as they're going, "Oh, holy shit!" And it also has stuff like pictures and video. It remembers, this is a visual medium. You don't want to be reading text off the screen. And don't go wrong, I don't hate reading in film, But I always find reading a text just like, oh god.
I don't know if it would be so bad if we don't have, in comparison, the original film that they did it a lot better, I agree. But when you have that and then it's like Helena's disappearance is just one of several weird things that is happening to, like, Riley. It's like, okay, that happens, but she was also getting these weird texts. Riley, she feels like she's in danger too, so that's partially why she's acting. Like, you have this, like, mystery element, you have, like, pressure element of people being killed, you have, like, the stuff with, like, Chris, which I'll get onto in a moment. You have a lot of stuff, and it's sad because, like I will admit that the main protagonist in concept and even kind of in execution is admittedly likable. Like, I did like Riley. I don't feel like the film really properly gave her the development that she should have gotten, and the development that she did get I didn't like, and again I'll get onto that in a moment. It didn't really fully allow us to, like, get inside her head. Like, you had moments, you had, like, glimmers, but largely it felt like she was at a bit of a distance all throughout.
Will kind of have a happening to her for quite a bit of it as well, and she was kind of acting. We didn't really get to see why she was acting because we didn't get to understand her as a character because I didn't focus on this film. Didn't really focus on character much until like the wants weren't set up, the needs weren't set up.
They try and say is that she's, like, inactive and that she doesn't want to do stuff.
Like that would be fine if she
but
didn't kind of do stuff.
they want to say that she's passive, but she's also kind of not passive, that she kind of cares about other people, but there's also this kind of element of selfishness with her character. Like, they had good ideas with this character, but they didn't quite fleshed out enough. That is nothing compared to the Chris character, aka the worst person in this film. Like,
Go on then, go on. I can tell you what I have around about this. Why don't we go?
I would have been okay with a character like this in concept if A, she was likable, or if B, she was unlikable, but the film was kind of aware of it. Unfortunately, this movie does the worst of both. Like, so Chris' character, she's set up as this, like, like, total feminist, extreme hardcore. Like, she got rid of, like, the Calvin Hawthorne bust that had, like, the goo coming out, that petition to get, like, Carrie Elways, the British professor, fired as well. And then she's kind of doing that performance that's like, make that song and dance performance that's like, making fun of the, like, AKO frat for, like, being rapists and stuff. It's like, all right, okay, like, I don't really mind a driven character like that, but yeah, like, especially I agree with some of the stuff she's saying, and it'd be fine with a character like that in theory. The problem is that they write her to be a total bitch, especially towards Riley. I mean, holy shit. Like, there are several, like, minor moments of her just being extremely uptight and uppity. There was this one minor moment that really pissed me off where Jesse or Marty just said, the girl who threw up in this one instance, and then she's like, woman. The other girl's like, oh, woman, sorry. Can you not take your friend just calling you a girl? It'd be one thing if one of the men was calling you a girl derisively, but, like, it's your friend. If you called me a boy, I wouldn't care.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I do prefer calling women women because it's what they are. But the thing that gets done is just like I've literally seen someone go hey girl to say hello to their mate. I've seen that, and it clearly wasn't meant as a I think less of us.
There's also other stuff too as well. In that scene where she's all like, why won't you sign this petition? And then she kind of wants Riley to, like, sign it in that cafe bit. And then she just starts, like, getting all, like, wanksty. I thought we were sisters. You guys don't want to confront the white supremacist patriarchy head on. You guys don't want to fight the good fight. It's like reacting this way towards, like, the other characters who aren't necessarily outwardly disagreeing with her. They're just saying stuff like, maybe that's enough crusading for one summer, or what, are we just not supposed to study, like, the classics? So she's all uppity and stuff, but it gets much, much worse when they bring in the stuff with Riley. She basically pressures Riley to do this performance, doesn't really give her a choice. She just sort of says, you have to do this. I don't care if your PTSD is going to get triggered. I don't care what's going to happen. I don't care if you're uncomfortable. You have to do this.
I think that's the worst thing, because it's almost like she's paying a lip service without living the ideals that she's paying a lip service to. That's the
and they even point that out as well, where they say, like, your situation with the professor isn't at all similar to Riley's situation.
She doesn't actually support her, sorority sisters at all. She's just kind of mean. It's almost like fighting for the general idea without actually living it. So it's effectively worthless because you don't show the human side to it. Because there's no human element to it. Like, you don't see her having any special care. Yeah, she steps in and saves someone, but most of that is her being violent against other people. I would say that's almost acting out of hate for those kind of men who are very hateable and deserve to be hated. Don't get me wrong, but there isn't, like, she says she cares about other women, but I don't get the emotion behind that. I don't get the.
She seems more like self-righteous. Seems more like she's more in favor of the cause that she's supposedly for than the actual human cost of it. Especially where Riley finds out from Carrie Elways that video of their performance had been posted online. I'm guessing that Riley didn't know that it would get posted online. It's not properly explained, but I'm guessing Riley didn't know that the performance was going to be filmed and posted online. And then she goes to confront like Chris about it. Everything she says is totally correct. She's like so pushy, or like even what I say at the end where I like name drop my rapist. Like, didn't you think about what would happen? Like now I'm getting these weird texts. Like she even says like we're not inspiring people, we're pissing people off and stuff. And like, yeah, that's right. That's totally
And
correct.
also, I think the worst part as well is she didn't consent to being recorded, like at all. And more importantly, he said, "I don't care if this triggers you, you have to do it." It's a bit like,
Yeah.
Jesus fucking Christ.
Says something along the lines of like, that's even more of a reason to do it. I think the worst bit is when she's like, "You used to be a fighter. It's time to be a fighter again." That sends some very uncomfortable implications about rape victims.
Basically says if you're not, 100% a strong fighter all the time, you're weak, you're not responding to your trauma correctly. And it's a bit like king trauma. I think what they were going for is, she's trying to inspire her friend into taking action that she thinks is going to help her. That's fine. Some goddamn sensitivity.
It could have been okay if she was like, "I get that you don't want to do this and you don't have to do this, but I feel like if you do it, then you might be able to," something like that. That's shows a bit of sensitivity. But they try and go,
"Hey, I really think you can do this." Like, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Or it's basically just not calling her weak or implying that she's weak would have been fine. Like most of the other dialogue is actually fine. Like, going, that's even more of a reason to do it. That's absolutely fine. The fact that she genuinely sat there and went, "You used to be a fighter," like, really derogatory. Fucking hell. Admittedly, I know very little about that kind of trauma, but from what I do know, it's kind of meant to, from what I understand, sometimes it can be a fight just to function normally, and sometimes that's an achievement.
Because people have different reactions, specifically around in the whole like college campus, roofie, frat boy, sexual assault, rooted in that kind of culture. And obviously, again, people have different reactions to that. So, like, some people go their lives without telling anybody. Some people make it public, like the woman who Brock Turner raped. I mean, she kept her name private for a few years, but like people have different reactions to it. But obviously, there's no.
Really needed a bit more time to kind of deal with it because she was still dealing with it throughout the film, just getting through it how she could, and she wasn't ready to kind of be that, and she shouldn't have been pushed like that. It would have been absolutely fine for Chris to have gone, "I really think you should report it," or "I really think you should do this." I'm not comfortable doing that. That's okay. If you need to deal with this in your own way, you deal with it. I'm just here to support you. That's how you handle that situation, I think.
It was more like she kind of wanted to like use Riley's stuff as like to help her cause, like saying, "Oh, you should sign this because this stuff happened to you," or "You should perform because this happened to you."
Taking ownership, or at least manipulating Riley's trauma for her own benefit.
And that wouldn't be so bad if the film was aware of it, but unfortunately, the film kind of backs up everything that Chris is saying. At the end of it, Riley even says, "I'm sorry, I should have been a fighter all along." It basically costs the Chris character as being 100% correct, and
it doesn't acknowledge the complexity at all of the emotions or the issues or the.
The very biggest problem overall with the film is that it takes very complicated subject matter, and I'm going to say it takes a one-sided approach.
I mean, there's only one side you should be on in the argument. It's very black and white about how that side should function.
The problem I have is that it doesn't really talk about its issues like an adult. It basically just turns the whole like women v men, like battle of the sexes, or at least like the battle against like toxic masculinity. It takes that and turns it into like a literal war, a literal like life or death situation. And I know that sometimes it can be a life or death situation, but it ignores like the subtle things that can come from that. It ignores nice guy culture, or it ignores the subtleties that can come from toxic masculinity, how it's not just rape and murder. It can be like slut shame, just simply a guy thinking that a woman is ugly or something like that. It can, but it takes it and it frames it in the most black and white, good versus evil manner possible. Maybe they were trying to be like empowering with that, but it ends up just thinking that it's a lot smarter than it is and thinking that it's more complex than it is. It even opens with like a made up quote, which I think only movies that are trying to seem smarter than they actually are do.
You shouldn't need to make up a quote to do it.
In the opening bit as well, way too much foreshadowing for that final reveal as well. There is a lot of foreshadowing. I mean, as soon as Carrie Elways appears as the professor, you kind of know that he's evil. I mean, you know that he's shifty, but you especially think to yourself, okay, well, this guy's probably the villain. It's part of the film's unsubtle nature. The frat can't be like subtly evil. You might as well have just revealed it from the beginning that they were behind the murders.
I mean, you knew anyway. I feel like that's a very modern Hollywood thing, though. Like subtleties kind of getting drained out of. Like I like when I mean more higher profile stuff. I mean a lot of lower profile stuff is all right and still gets to keep it. But I just notice it in a lot of, I don't want to say mainstream because that's not quite what I mean. But
Like, sometimes it depends on good writing, sometimes it depends on bad writing, but sometimes it's also in regards to like social commentary. I don't think that subtlety is like a necessity, but in regards to like stuff like foreshadowing or storytelling or even characterization, I do think subtlety is a very powerful tool. Unless you're just going full on camp, then you think subtlety is a necessity. I think especially in a horror film, subtlety is scary, but the film
agreed.
didn't have that, or at least it didn't have it as much as it should have. There's that bit where Riley sees that ritual where there's some stuff they show at the beginning. Not much suspense because you kind of just know what's going on. Again, I do think that maybe if the film lengthened itself, given itself a bit more time to breathe, then maybe it could have, especially the bit where Nate, the boyfriend, speaks up. He might as well have just been wearing a sign at that moment that said, "I am a straw man douchebag, disagree with me and hate me." I really hated that scene because the scene as it was going kind of well when Riley was calling out Chris and saying stuff. You're being so pushy, not everybody wants to be like you, and saying stuff that was correct, and I was on her side. But then all of a sudden, like, the boyfriend just speaks up, right? The boyfriend of Marty, this boyfriend character who was kind of in the background. All we really knew about him was that he was getting a bit annoyed and recording the performance, so clearly he was for what they were talking about, but he was kind of getting annoyed. And the point is that he didn't get enough screen time for this outburst to be very effective.
It felt very contrived.
It was supposed to imply that he was being psychically affected by the bust, so therefore he was reverting back to like being an asshole or something, or a toxic asshole. So I think that was what it was supposed to be. But the problem is that story-wise, it doesn't really feel earned. What's weird is that it's done just to get him out of the house, and then he comes back in, and then he dies. You would have thought if they were going to have him be pushed out, that either that would be done so therefore he's not there later on, or so therefore he can then come back and redeem himself somehow. But he doesn't redeem himself. Like, he tries to redeem himself by being, "Hey, where are you? Show yourself!" But he just gets killed instantly. He doesn't get a moment to like properly fight back or anything.
Undercut the actual emotional crux of the argument that was being had. The actual one bit of nuance we were starting to get.
It's even worse when you actually break that moment down because, first of all, it's so like breezed through and so like shouty that you don't really get a chance to properly digest what like the boyfriend is saying in response. Eventually it just becomes a really like hammy argument and they literally force him out. But the stuff that he's saying, again, it's like straw manning. He's saying stuff that is so clearly wrong, and it's just sort of written so therefore we as the audience can be like, that's wrong. It was very, very obvious here, and again, it's forced into a scene where it doesn't really belong. What's even worse is that there's this one exchange where like he almost brings up a good point. To describe the scene, he basically just goes like, "Oh, what the hell did you expect was going to happen? I mean, you basically called out these people, of course they're pissed off," and then he's kind of saying like, "Oh, you're just all like man hating." And there's this one weird moment where he actually makes a good point where Chris says, "Well, men have all the power," and then he's like, "Not all men have power," and I'm like, oh, okay, that's kind of smart. That is kind of true when you think about it. Plenty of men deal with issues of like class or race or sexuality, or even like men obviously face similar stigma about like, speaking up about sexual assault and abuse. But then she's like, "Oh my god, did you just not all men me?" He wasn't referring to the not all men thing. He was just saying that not all men have power.
I mean,
Not all men are
did refer to the not all men bit, but the whole exchange it just didn't work. And I mean, it undercut the emotional dynamics of Riley and Chris, which then never get picked up again in the film.
Yeah, only once at the end, is it kind of brought back. But other than that, yeah, that's the last time you majorly see it.
Yeah, they don't properly ever really resolve it.
Other than just, I guess, agree that Chris was right the whole time, I guess. Other than that, but it's not properly discussed. I agree.
Got to that point. That's the biggest problem.
Yeah, it just sort of feels like she's kind of doing it because it's like, oh, the situation's so bad that I guess I have to fight back against the stuff, or I guess you're right because they were doing this stuff that's bad, but that doesn't mean that Chris's actions were good. Another thing as well is that Chris was kind of responsible for a lot of the stuff that happened because her getting the bust moved to the fraternity then meant that they discovered the goo in the first place. If she just let the bust stay where it was, then nobody would have discovered that and people wouldn't have been killed.
I don't even mind her getting rid of the bust.
Obviously, she couldn't have known that that's what would happen, but she is kind of indirectly responsible. Her character, again, there's moral ambiguity that the film just doesn't address. What they wanted to do is they wanted to get behind the message, but they didn't realize that in the process, the way they were framing it, it wasn't quite as black and white as they were making it out to be. The boyfriend, as largely shitty as he was in that scene, had one good point, but because he used some unfortunate wording, Chris got distracted and didn't actually see what he was talking about, and yeah, and it was a lot of this could have been fixed by just making Chris a more likable character, or properly making it just black and white, because if you just made it black and white, then that would be one thing, but because it's not, yet the film tries to treat it as such, it kind of ends up creating this weird mix. The weird character inconsistency too. In the bit where they escape the house, right? It weirdly felt like the characterization for those two characters switched. All of a sudden, Riley was saying, no, we have to take this to the fraternity, and then Chris was saying, we shouldn't confront this head on, we should just go to the police. So why are the two of you being so out of character? It feels like the characters got switched at that moment.
I don't know, just the dynamic shifted a lot in that scene, to be honest.
Yeah, they did, and I just don't know why.
It felt like someone had taken an argument that might have happened in real life or in some corner of Reddit and just went, yeah, I'm going to just make this a scene without any of the nuance to undercut the fact that they didn't want to criticize Chris because they went, oh no, that means we're undermining the whole idea of the feminist movement we're going for. No, it doesn't. It just calls out the fact that she did a kind of uncomfortable thing that kind of made Riley unable to kind of act for herself in a bit and kind of undercut her whole point. That's all that.
A good way to have improved the climax would be okay, that character thing got switched. They should have switched the characters back and had Chris be the one who got captured and then Riley who comes in to save her, because then Riley would have been embracing being a fighter, so to speak, and then Chris could have had that moment where she said, I'm sorry I endangered you, or I shouldn't have dragged you into this. Chris kind of realizing my actions, as well intentioned as they were, did put people in danger. It would have at least gone a bit of a way to slightly redeeming that character, I feel.
I think it definitely would have mitigated some of the difficulty around that character, because I think it wasn't handled very well. It was too overt, I'm not against overt themes, but it was overt in the way that it felt. She didn't feel like a character as much as she did a walking
filibuster. I'm wondering if the stuff that this character was saying is stuff that the writers themselves or the director herself feels, and they're just kind of putting them into that character, maybe.
Yeah, it felt like an insert rather than a person. It didn't feel like it almost felt like a textbook given life, or a political pamphlet given life.
I'm going to compare this to original. Again, the original one, this was a human being that just so happened to represent all of the women who want to get abortions, or women who were against the anti-abortion movement. She was a person, but she also had that thing that kind of added a bit of dimension to her. She wasn't going around saying, I'll sign my petition against this anti-abortion person. It wasn't like that. They could have easily taken the themes of the original film and maybe given them more depth, put them at the forefront in a way that would have been very fitting for people who actually deal with this stuff. You could have easily just taken the pro-choice stuff and put it in this version of the film, and you could have even combined it with the whole college rape aspect that they're going for. Riley could have gotten pregnant through that rape, and she could have been all I want to get this baby aborted or something like that,
Oh god, yeah, that would have been such a complicated thing as well.
You could have transplanted the boyfriend figure. That issue, or even in today, it's still a complicated subject matter. I mean, obviously people are more in favor of abortion than they were back in the 70s, but even then I could still believe that a character like Peter could exist, a guy like that, because you could have taken Peter and you could have updated him to be one of these right-wing evangelical Christians or something, who's all no, abortion's murder. You could have done that, and that I think would have been effective. Fortunately, again, because of the storytelling, we don't really get enough of Riley actually confronting her abuser. We get that a couple of times, but we don't really get it fully, and that kind of thematic baggage just sort of gets lost in favor of, again, the film's attempt at conveying this message that doesn't really work. In conclusion, Christmas 1974, I would definitely recommend it. A good slasher film, has good social commentary to go along with it. Black Christmas 2019, unfortunately, no, skip it. Definitely don't watch it. Yeah.
Agreed with that.
Next episode, it will just be one film. We're going to be discussing Highlander. See ya.
Bye.